Okay, this is our last video for Social Science Section 1. I'm on page 39. We're continuing to talk about society and the Cold War, and this is specifically American society that we're getting at here. We're looking to begin with at science during the Cold War and the impact that Sputnik has on American education and science. So 1957, October 4th, the Soviet Union sends the world's first satellite into space. Over here on the right is a little picture of someone working on it. There was another picture of it during our music resource guide. Remember, it wasn't as large as what we might think of a satellite being. This was incredibly shocking because the United States had no idea that the Soviets were that close to getting something out into outer space. Then they follow really quickly with sending a dog, the first living being, into outer space. So this is really, really frightening the United States and scientists there. The same intercontinental ballistic missiles, that's an important phrase, intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, that's what they're commonly called. These had launched the satellites up into space by the Soviet Union. The United States really realized really quickly that those missiles could also be used to send nuclear weapons thousands of miles away. So creating the missiles is at least as important as creating the technology that goes into orbit. Getting something out of the United States' atmosphere up into orbit using those missiles, that's the big thing that's frightening to the United States. And the idea of how far advanced the Soviet Union was with scientific discovery. So after Sputnik happens, the threat of a surprise Soviet attack struck new levels of terror into the hearts of Americans. And this grips the United States. The United States starts throwing money at the problem and trying to figure out how can we answer this. So one answer is NASA. Eisenhower announced the creation of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. What he's trying to do here is increase interest in science, math, engineering, and foreign languages. They want people to be able to compete with the Soviets. Foreign languages, partly important so that they can spy or interpret the information coming out of other countries. Now we have 1958. The National Defense Act. This throws a lot of money at this problem. $1 billion in federal spending, funding research grants, student loans, scholarship, curriculum development, trying to beef up America's educational system, specifically around science. This is when the first real focus in American public education became focused on science. Before it was always reading, writing, and arithmetic. Those three things, the reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's what the United States the American education system cared about. In the 50s, we start focusing on science so much more. The idea grounding our type of science is called liberal democracy. If you remember, the foundational idea around democracy in the Cold War has to do with freedom of thought, freedom of idea, freedom of choice. That's what liberal democracy is, okay? And as an offshoot of liberal democracy, applying that to science, we have what's called scientific inquiry. So the United States wants to at least sound like it's not telling its scientists what to do. Instead, the United States wants it to look like they have the freedom to discover. So there's this interesting story about one of the Soviet scientists and the idea of him rejecting certain scientific principles because the Soviet Union tells him to. And the United States seizes on that. And they say that the United States supports science just for science's sake. I mean, this isn't necessarily true, but it sounds good and it fits their narrative. 10 years later, by 1967, the United States is spending $15 million every year to secretly fund 38 private scientific organizations, supposedly private. It's an example of the subterfuge that the United States government was willing to engage in order to get the winning outcome in the Cold War. Now we're going to switch from science over to math for a minute. So in addition to science getting this Cold War boost, you heard me say that it was science and math, it was engineering, it was math, it was foreign languages, things like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the math side of things. Game theory comes around during this time, just a little bit before the Cold War, but it starts to take really strong hold during the Cold War itself. So here, game theory is pioneered in the in the 1940s by a group of mathematicians. The leader is John von Neumann, and they began to formalize outcomes in games of chance. That's game theory. This this new field of math is intriguing and interesting to the government because global nuclear war, it's insane. There is no logic to it. No one would engage in nuclear war unless they were insane and really wanted to be suicidal. So this game theory starts to put a little bit of rationality toward this uncertainty and insanity. John Nash applies game theory to American Cold War strategy. Here's this proposal from John Nash. In non-cooperative games, each side is going to pursue strategies designed to maximize their individual gain. At the same time, they're going to assume that the other side is doing the same thing. This symmetry provides something known as the Nash equilibrium. As we take it further, the Nash equilibrium produces a stalemate, and this ties into something that we learned about earlier in Section 1. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, he had this strategy of mutually assured destruction. Here's a picture of John Nash over here. Mutually assured destruction is founded on the principles of game theory. So now, starting to see how all this preparation for nuclear war is impacting ordinary people. This is taking hold everywhere. Children, adults, families. You heard me early in the introduction of Section 1 talking about how people got their blood type tattooed on their chest. There was all kinds of efforts to help American citizens prepare for a nuclear attack on the nation. The Federal Civil Defense Administration is who's in charge of these campaigns, these public educational campaigns. There's a very interesting video that I'm going to post after we do when I do the extra links. This video features a turtle whose name is Bert, and it talks about the nuclear drills that children used to do in schools, kind of like our active shooter drills that we have to do here. They did nuclear fallout drills. So during the 1950s, family-sized nuclear fallout shelters were being built in people's backyards. They're like backyard bunkers. You can actually still buy houses in the Iowa State Fair neighborhood here in Des Moines that continue to have these bunkers buried in the backyard. Periodically, you'll see one go on real estate sales, and it's very interesting. And it's just like a buried bunker in the backyard. Private corporations were building these big underground facilities to try to protect their records and their top secret research. It was also meant to be able to house top level people. There are lots and lots of underground facilities. In fact, there's one in Omaha that President George Bush flew to during the September 11th attacks. These bunkers still exist. They're still around. They just don't get necessarily used for the same thing on a regular basis. They're kind of outdated now, but they still exist. This is an interesting little aside. Eisenhower is known very much for creating the interstate highway system. That is his biggest thing that he did domestically within the United States' boundaries. 41,000 miles of interstate highways in less than 10 years. This was the first time that the United States roads system went from just being a series of little highways that connected small towns to being really fast interstates, 4 lanes that people could get from one place to another quickly without stopping. This was really all purposed for nuclear war preparation. It was meant to make it so that large military vehicles could get people away from densely populated areas to safer locations. That's really why we have the interstate highway system. All right, next we're going to talk about the military-industrial complex. All of this building, all of this money, combined with the fact that we have capitalism in our country, means that private corporations want a piece of this pie. For the first time, we start to see American industry really getting a lot of money related to the military. This is something called the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower warned against this. He said that this would be a big problem to privatize our military in essence. And it has proven to be a massive issue. Notice this phrase, a mushrooming defense industry. Since the Cold War, the amount of money that the United States spends on defense has gone nowhere but up. It is massive how much money we spend on defense. And private contractors get the majority of that money. So one of the companies is Boeing. Boeing you might recognize as the manufacturer of airplanes. Well, they had lucrative contracts supplying the government with military aircraft, heavy equipment. This becomes one of the largest companies related to this military industrial complex. And then here are other ones that you might remember or recognize names of. Other defense contractors, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. Here's the inevitable byproduct of privatizing the military and giving it to capitalist companies. They are going to try to lobby Congress to get more money. They want more money all the time. And so they're going to have lobbyists, and they're going to try really hard to get everything they can possibly get. That's one of the negative byproducts that Eisenhower warned against. So, why is this so bad? If you remember from economics, you have to have a trade-off. When defense gets more money, that means you have less money for our domestic priorities, like education, like infrastructure, social programs. Eisenhower was trying to put restraints on how much money that defense was getting, but this really did not go much of anywhere. Once this Pandora's box was opened, it has just gone crazy. For example, here you go. Here's Lockheed Martin in 2019. They make weapons. They have $50 billion in government contracts today. This also has an impact on arts, literature, and film. The book 1984 is one that you'll read if you are in high school here at UHS. 1984 is written by George Orwell, and it's kind of seen as an allegory for what's going on with the Cold War. We have science fiction becomes really popular for the first time. All of this imagination about what could go wrong, all of this is fed by things happening with the Cold War and nuclear war possibilities. Other films, Manchurian Candidate, these talk about communist brainwashing. Science fiction continues to become a popular genre after the Cold War. Our book that we're going to read is another one that is Cold War related. Soviet literature, I want you to quickly read through this about Pasternak. This is an author who wrote Dr. Zhivago. He kind of goes back and forth with popularity and whether he's approved or not by the Soviet Union. Samizdat is related to this. The banned works in the Soviet Union, they're passed on from person to person and they get really tattered. That's called samizdat. If you were caught engaging in samizdat, you could be sent to the Gulag, which is a forced labor camp. Solzhenitsyn is another author from the Soviet Union that has some writing that is banned. interesting ideas, all from the Soviet Union.